Most people try to change a response. I'll just feel calm next time. I won't react. I'll do better. But the response is the end of the chain. By the time you get there, the pattern has already run. Welcome back. I'm Rob, creator of the MindShift Method, Cognitive Pattern Reprogramming. This is the 8th episode in our podcast. In the last episode, we unpacked something that sits right at the core of why people feel stuck and why you keep getting the same results even when you're trying to change. What we landed on was this, it's not about effort, it's not about motivation, it's not even about knowing what to do, it's about pattern, because the same situation shows up, the same internal process runs, and the same outcome follows, over and over and over again. If you're honest with yourself, you've probably seen this in your own life. You've had moments where you've said, this time will be different, and for a while it is. You actually show up differently, you respond differently, and you feel like you're making progress. And something happens, a certain tone by someone, a certain situation you're involved in, a certain kind of pressure, maybe at work or at home. Without even thinking about it, you're right back in the same response, same frustration, same reaction, and the same outcome. And this is where most people start to turn on themselves. They think, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just change? Why do I keep doing this? But here's the truth. There's nothing wrong with you. What's happening is that something automatic is running. And that automatic process is the pattern. You're not stuck because of your circumstances. You're stuck because of the cognitive patterns your brain is running. And until that pattern changes, everything else tends to fall back into place. Let's slow this down just for a moment and actually understand what it is that we're dealing with. Because once you understand the structure of a pattern, you stop blaming yourself. You start seeing where change is actually possible. Pattern is not just behaviour. It's not just what you do. It's the way your mind processes what's happening. It's how your brain interprets a situation, decides what it means, predicts what might happen next, and then triggers a response. And it does all of that fast. It does all of that automatically before you've had time to think. That's before logic steps in and before you've even realised what's happening. Let me give you a simple way to picture this. Imagine your brain like a system that's been programmed over time. Every situation that you've ever faced activates a certain program. Most people believe they're choosing how they respond in that moment. But what's actually happening is this. The situation occurs, the program activates, and the response begins automatically. That's why it feels so fast. That's why it feels like it just happens. Because in many ways it actually does. Now here's where it gets really important. Two people can experience the exact same situation and have completely different responses. Same conversation, same words, same environment. One person stays calm. The other person feels triggered. One person leans in. The other person pulls away. What's the difference? It's not the situation. It's not the words. It's the pattern interpreting the situation. This is exactly where most people get caught because they think they're reacting to what's happening. But what they're actually reacting to is what their mind has made it to mean. So if we break down a pattern, it has three core parts. Firstly, the trigger, then the internal process, and finally the response. So let's start with the trigger. Something happens, a comment, a look, a delay, a tone, even a thought, or no like on that post you made. Then the internal process. This is where everything really happens. Your mind starts working, interpreting, predicting, filling in gaps, connecting it to past experiences. It does this quickly, really quickly. Then comes a response, what you do, what you say, how you feel, and how your body reacts. Now here's the key insight. Most people try to change a response. They say, I'll just feel calm next time. I won't react. I'll do better. But the response is the end of the chain. By the time you get there, the pattern has already run. It's already decided what this means. It's already activated your body. It's already set the direction. So if you actually want change to happen, you can't just work at the level of behaviour. You have to move upstream into the internal process, because that's where the pattern lives. There's one belief that quietly sits underneath a lot of these patterns, and that's something called an external locus of control, which simply means you believe that what's happening outside of you is what's causing how you feel. They made me feel like this. That situation stressed me out. That's the reason I reacted. But here's what's really happening. The outside world is just the trigger. Your pattern is what creates the experience. If you don't see that, you'll spend your time trying to control everything around you. Other people, situations, outcomes, instead of learning how to influence what's happening inside you. So here's the shift I want you to sit with. The world doesn't create your response. Your pattern does. Once you start to see that clearly, something changes. Because now, you're no longer just reacting to life. You're starting to understand how your mind is shaping it. That's where real change begins. So now let's just go a little deeper into what actually happens inside that internal process. Because this is where most people feel like things are just happening to them, when in reality, there's a very specific sequence playing out. The mind doesn't just observe what's happening. It builds a version of it. It does that through a set of shortcuts, through a set of filters, through learned ways of making sense of the world. Once you understand these, you start to see why the same patterns keep repeating, keep showing up. One of the biggest drivers inside this process is what we call global thinking. This is where the mind takes one moment and turns it into everything. Text isn't responded to immediately, and it becomes, they don't care. A conversation feels off. It becomes, this always happens. Something doesn't go your way, and suddenly nothing ever works. The mind zooms out instantly. It takes a single data point and paints the whole picture. When that happens, you're no longer responding to the moment. You're responding to a much bigger story, and we move into something just as important, a lack of distinction. This is where your mind stops separating things properly. The past blends into the present. Old experience start influencing current situations. One person starts to represent many people. So instead of responding to what's actually happening right now, you're responding to everything that feels similar. This is why sometimes your reaction feels bigger than the situation. It's not just about the situation. It's about everything your mind has connected it to. And we start to move into internal orientation. And this is another big one. This is where your focus turns inward. into your thoughts, into your images and your imagined scenarios. What if this goes wrong? What if I think this? What if I can't handle it? Your mind starts running simulations, playing out possibilities, trying to predict outcomes. Here's the important part. Your body doesn't know the difference between real and imagined. So it responds to those imagined scenarios as if they're real. So your heart rate changes, your breathing shifts, tension builds. And now you're not just thinking something, you're feeling it. This is where anxiety starts to grow. Not necessarily from what's happening, but from what your mind is creating. Now, when we layer that on top of poor compartmentalization, which is where everything starts blending together, work doesn't stay at work, it follows you home. One conversation doesn't stay contained, it spreads into everything else. And then one issue becomes 5, and the 5 becomes 10, then the 10 becomes 20. Suddenly everything feels overwhelming. The reason behind this is because there are no clear boundaries between things. And finally, there's low tolerance for ambiguity, the need to know, the need for certainty, the need to have it all figured out. Life doesn't always give you that. So your mind tries to fill in the gaps. When it does, it usually fills them with worst case scenarios. Because the brain is wired to protect you. The brain is wired to anticipate risk, to prepare for what might go wrong. When that runs unchecked, it creates stress where there doesn't need to be stress. Now, when all of these elements combine, global thinking, lack of distinction, internal orientation, poor compartmentalization, and a low tolerance for ambiguity, you don't just have a thought, you have a full experience, an emotional response, as well as a physical reaction and a behavioural outcome, all driven by a pattern that feels automatic. This is where people feel stuck, because it feels like it's happening to them, like it's out of their control. And once you can see the structure, you start to realize something really important. This isn't random. It's a process. It's learned. And anything that runs as a process can be changed as a process. Anything that's learned can be unlearned. Something else replaced. So the question now becomes, where do you step in? The answer is definitely not at the end or at the response, because by then it's already in motion. It's already too late. So the trick is you step in earlier, closer to the start of the process. The very first step is awareness, noticing the pattern as it begins, noticing the trigger, noticing the first interpretation, noticing the story starting to form. Because once you can see it happening, you're no longer completely inside it. You've created a small amount of separation. In that separation, there's an opportunity to pause, even briefly, even for a few seconds, because inside that pause, the automatic process slows down. This is where real change begins. Not by force, not by fighting the pattern, but by interrupting it, by stepping out of the automatic loop, even just enough to see it clearly. And once you can see it clearly, you can start to influence it. You can begin to question it. What am I adding to this? What assumptions am I making? Is there another way to see this? Now, instead of being driven by the pattern, you're engaging with it. You're no longer just reacting. You're starting to respond. And that shift, even though it feels small, is where everything begins to change. Now, once you've started to notice the pattern, once you can see the trigger, the internal process, and how that internal process leads to the response, the next step is where real change starts to occur. Because awareness on its own is powerful, but it's not enough. You don't just want to see the pattern. You want to change what runs instead. This is where most people get tripped up, because they try to stop the pattern completely, try to shut it down, get rid of it, push it away. But patterns don't work like that. Every pattern at some point in your life was useful. It helped you cope, helped you adapt, helped you make sense of something. Might even have helped you avoid conflict, helped you stay safe, helped you stay in control. But now it's outdated. Instead of trying to remove it, you need to update it. That happens in 2 steps: interruption and replacement. The first, interruption, breaking the automatic loop, creating that gap we spoke about. Because without that gap, the old pattern just keeps running. This is where something simple becomes incredibly powerful. Pause. Look up. Breathe. These 3 small actions put together interrupt the pattern. They shift your physiology. They bring you out of the internal loop and create space between the trigger and the response. In that space, you have a choice. At first, that space might be small, might be barely noticeable. But the more you practice it, the more it grows. That's where the second step comes in. Replacement. Because it's not enough to stop the old pattern. You need to give your mind something else to run. So instead of assuming, you start checking. Instead of jumping to a global conclusion, you narrow your focus. What actually happened here? Not what it means about everything, just what actually happened. Instead of blending everything together, you now separate it. This is this moment, not every moment, not every person, not every experience. So instead of going fully inward into imagined outcomes, you bring your attention back outward to what you can see, what you can hear, what you can actually confirm. Instead of needing certainty, you begin to allow for not knowing. Of course, that's uncomfortable at first, but it's incredibly freeing over time, because you stop filling the gaps with worst case scenarios. Here's something that's very important to both remember and understand. This is not about being perfect, not trying to get this right every time, not trying to eliminate the old pattern overnight. You're building something new. That happens through repetition. Every time you interrupt the old pattern and run a slightly different process, your brain starts to learn, to recognize that there's another option. Over time, that option becomes more familiar. The new option becomes more automatic. So eventually, the new pattern is the one that runs first. You respond instead of react. You separate instead of globalize. You observe instead of assume. You tolerate uncertainty instead of trying to control everything. This is where the real change happens. Lasting change. Not through force, not through willpower, but through changing the way your mind processes. So as you move through your day to day, maybe start to notice where does the pattern show up? What triggers it? What story begins to form? You can pause, look up, breathe, even briefly, before it runs its full course. Because that moment, that small gap, that interruption, is where your power is. That's where the pattern starts to shift. The more you access that, the more control you begin to feel, not over everything around you, but over how you process it. And that changes everything. Because once you can change the pattern, you don't have to keep fighting the same outcomes. You start creating different outcomes that serve you much better. Now, in the next episode, we're going to take this even further, because it's one thing to interrupt a pattern. It's another thing entirely to install a new one, so consistency become your default. Instead of catching yourself after the fact, you start showing up differently from the beginning. So that's where we're heading in the next session. And I'll see you in the next episode.